Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Sigsworth. I have had quite an association now for nearly 6 or 7 years with the University of Dundee, and last summer I was very honoured to be one of their honorary graduates. But my other hat that I wear is I also chair the SEPA, which is the Environment Agency in Scotland. So obviously tonight's subject is the winds of change, rethinking the way we respond to climate change, is something very dear to my heart there as well. And I think on the back of any of you who have kept up with what happened at Davos just a few weeks ago, and all the debate that went on about climate change there and the need for rapid international movement on what we're doing, I hope some of you actually saw Al Gore's contribution there. It's on YouTube if you haven't seen it. Certainly worth seeing how he looks at all the downsides that the climate change can bring to us if we don't take advantage of what he sees as many, many opportunities to move forward and benefit from those changes. And on the back of that, I think tonight's discussion is going to be very relevant. And I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that you decide to contribute. The speakers are going to cover the Scottish situation at the moment. We're going to be looking at how we actually influence change, what the drivers can be and how the power of collaboration in doing that can help. And we're also going to look at some lessons from Australia. That's all going to take 20 minutes, and then the floor's yours. That's what I've been told anyways. So what I would say, just as a little sort of PR for my own organisation, SEPA, one of our statutory jobs is to report on the state of Scotland's environment. And any of you who are interested, we have a website now that we've helped build in collaboration with the Scottish Government and many other partners, called Scotland's Environment Web. Write that down. If you go on there, you'll find a very, very up-to-date and very interactive base of information that helps you understand in great depth what's happening in Scotland and to do some of your own research. And now, without more ado, I want to introduce Ian Flazy, who is the chair of the social dimensions of climate change in the Department of Environment in the University of Dundee. Ian, I hand over to you.
Thank you. Wow, it's lovely to be here, and welcome everybody. It's really nice to see so many people that have come out to what I think is, if not certainly one of the most significant challenges that is facing our time. Just before I start, what I'm going to do here is just give a very short sort of introduction, really to set the scene for the other three speakers and to think about what we mean by climate change and what it means to us in Scotland, and then widen that out to our international guests. But before we do that, we've just had a really excellent international meeting, and we have some really other distinguished guests down here at the front. So we have somebody all the way from Papua New Guinea, somebody from Ghana, Australia, the US, and closer to home as well. So really a warm welcome to them too. So winds of change, climate change. Well, what are we talking about here in relation to Scotland? Well, we know that climate is already changing. Climate has already changed in Scotland. This is just a simple kind of graph of some of the changes since 1961 in the average temperature in Scotland. And the darker areas of red that you can see around here, these are where the average temperature has increased the most. So here's 4 different seasons: spring, summer, autumn and winter. And if you look at the southern areas of Scotland, particularly in winter, the temperature since 1961 has actually increased by about 2 degrees centigrade. So the changes are already happening, and many people are starting to experience those changes here on our doorstep today. By 2050, we're going to be looking at hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. By 2080, summer temperatures are going to increase by probably greater than 3 degrees centigrade. What does that mean? Sounds quite nice, really. But actually, if we look at some of the research back from actually some recent research in Australia, they tried to look at that. And what they tried to do is they tried to compare the cooler, wetter areas, and as they modelled the increases in temperature, they tried to look at what other parts of Australia in the cool would look like. So that what would the wetter areas become in terms of the drier areas? And as we know, there's some very dry areas in Australia. What they found was once you get up to a 3 or 4 degrees centigrade rise, there was nowhere else in Australia that these cooler, wetter areas would look like. So it was kind of literally off the scale. So a 3 degree centigrade rise is very, very, very significant in terms of changing the impacts, having impacts on us and changing the way that we might be able to live. So what does this really mean for Scotland? Well, it's kind of difficult to predict, but we're going to be looking at more situations like this, flooding. This is the Perth railway line. We're also going to be looking at things like increased risks of landslides. That's the Rest and Be Thankful road out on Argyll and Bute. Many of you will know that. The irony here is that last November, some of our students were meant to go on a trip to study landslides, but they couldn't go on the study because of the landslide. So there are kind of these immediate impacts that we know will probably be coming. It's going to be harder to deal with these extreme weather events. But on top of that, it's kind of a little bit more challenging than that, because not only is it the immediate impacts on Scotland, but it's everything else that's happening around the world. So things like increase in food prices, for example, as climate impacts other parts of the world. It's very difficult to predict these things, but we know we're entering a great period of uncertainty in terms of the things that are likely to come. But for me, it's much, much, much more than that. And for me, it's very much a moral issue. And this is really highlighted, nicely highlighted by some work by this guy, John Nault from the University of Tennessee. And I saw a talk of his a couple of years ago. And it really moved me, because what he was basically saying, he's an environmental ethicist, and he's trying to explore and he tries to work out, to a certain degree, what is the impact of the carbon emissions that we're producing in Western countries today on others around the world. And he came up with this conclusion. The average UK citizen, or American or Australian, is responsible through his or her greenhouse gas emissions for the suffering and or deaths of 1 or 2 future people. So literally, the impact of the carbon emissions that we are creating in this room, at this particular moment, will harm other people in the future. So for me, that really highlights that climate change is not just about what will impact Scotland, but it's also about how the carbon emissions from Scotland will impact others. So really, from my kind of perspective, it's all about change. Things are changing, things are going to change, and that change will probably accelerate. But on top of that, then, it's about how we adapt to those changes and how we adapt to those impacts, but also about how we try to change our lives and the ways in which society operates to reduce the carbon emissions that we're producing. And there are lots of very positive things that are starting to happen now. And if you're lucky to be in Dundee next Saturday on St. Valentine's Day, Friends of the Earth and some local groups will be inviting you to write on postcards that we will be able to send to our politicians about the things that we love, that we think will change as a result of climate change. So it really kind of brings it to home that many, many things are changing, and it's really going to be important to act. So that's really just setting the scene, and just setting the scene for the other speakers to have their say and to contribute to the conversation. So I'd like to now hand over to Paul Ryan. Paul has a huge expertise. He's the director of the Australian Resilience Centre, and he has an excellent expertise in working collaboratively with large groups of people at kind of landscape scales across a wide part of Australia. So I'll hand over to you, Paul.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity. It's a great honour to be here. Climate change in Australia is a really challenging issue, and like it is everywhere. And I'm just going to give a quick snapshot of, I'm not going to talk a lot about the detail, but more about how we might think about that challenge, that change that we need to undertake, rather than talk much about the science. But I did want to start with just something that's got a link to Scotland, and I'll talk about it in a second. But this is just a little excerpt of a poem which is very famous in Australia. It's called My Country, and it's by a woman called Dorothea McKellar. I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. I love her far horizons, I love her jewel seas, her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. Now that poem, even saying it now, gives me goosebumps. For an Australian, that captures perfectly, more than anything else, more than any film, any book could possibly capture, the identity, the essence of the Australian continent. It talks a lot about its structure, it's the way it looks and the way it feels, and about that incredible variability we have in the climate, the extremes of climate, which Australia is sort of well known for. The interesting link here is that Dorothea was descended from good Scottish stock. Her grandparents came from Scotland, and she actually wrote this poem. Most people believe she wrote it in Australia, but she actually wrote it in the UK, and possibly while she was visiting family in Scotland, some people think. And she was homesick. So she was trying to capture the essence of the country from afar. And of course, when Europeans arrived in Australia, they didn't go to an empty landscape. They went to a landscape that was already populated by the Indigenous people, the Aboriginal people, who'd been there for maybe as long as 60,000 years. And those people had worked out how to live in that landscape. They'd worked out about the social systems, the rules, the belief systems, the religious practices that you need to have for a landscape that's so variable and so extreme. And so what did we do as the first Europeans to arrive? We displaced those people, and we just imported a Northern Hemisphere perspective, and we tried to bring our practices and our beliefs and our ways of doing things from the Northern Hemisphere and impose it on this landscape. And it works for a little while, but as we know, eventually the wheel turns. And so even though agriculture and the development of agriculture has been incredibly important for the livelihoods, my whole family are farmers and have been farming for 150 years there, the reality is we still haven't come to terms after this length of time with the Australian climate. And so we have lots of problems around land degradation that are already in the system from our inability to deal with a variable climate and extreme climate. And now the climate's changing, and it's changing fast. And in Australia, we feel like we're right on the front line of climate change. And I could put up all sorts of maps and stats and figures, but this little diagram sums it up perfectly for me. This is from a map from our National Weather Forecasting Agency. And it's just for a date, you'll see down the bottom there, for January 2013, so in the middle of our summer. This is the forecast for the next day. The really interesting bit of this is the little purple blob there in the middle, because on that day they were predicting a temperature somewhere between 50 and 54 degrees for that part of the landscape. And that's the first time since European settlement that a forecast in that magnitude had been made. And so they actually had to introduce a new colour. Now, it doesn't sound very exciting, but it was actually quite a big deal in Australia that they had to come up with a new colour to put on the map and recalibrate down the side there, because this is off the scale, as we've already heard. So this is the type of change we're seeing, and it's right in our face. And of course, when you're talking about a landscape that can have these sorts of extremes, it'll have extreme impacts. This is a very confronting image. And I'll be honest, I sort of considered not showing it because it is so confronting, but this is the reality. So this is the sort of reality that we're seeing, and it's happening a lot. And there's fires in Australia at the moment in a number of areas in the west and in the south of the states. And even today, it's extreme fire danger for the whole eastern part of Victoria where I live. So this is the reality of climate change, and we're right on we feel like we're right on the very forefront of that climate change in Australia and feeling those impacts. But so what do we do about it? How can we move beyond what is a very frightening setting and a frightening situation for a lot of us to face? And as Johan mentioned, we've spent a lot of time over the last few years going around the country talking to a few thousand people now about what they think about the future, what they think about the changes they're seeing, what do they value, what do they care about, what are their aspirations. And I haven't got enough time to go into a lot of detail about it, but what's really clear is one key message comes out. When you sit down and talk to people, they care about things, the simple things and small things. So it's often easy to get caught up in climate change as this global scale issue, and of course, you know, and all the politics around it. As in Australia, we've had a sort of toxic political debate around climate change. But when you go and talk to people and sit down, they're often really worried just about things like the loss of their favourite little water hole or their little wetland that they like to go to? What if it dries up where they like to go and watch birds? Or and small things really matter. And so we've focused on trying to build ways of working with people to understand what are the small things and what can we do about managing small things. And we think by building from small to large, we can have a pretty significant impact. The other thing that stands out is that it's very clear that people in every setting just about that we talk to people is that they have a little seed of optimism inside. So most people think and hope that the world will be better. Even though we might be quite negative outwardly, when you actually talk to people, most people think the world can be a better place. And so we're trying to work out how do we work with that type of hope, the little seed of hope that sits in everyone, and how do we support that change so that we can have a positive projection forward, if you like, so that we're not just looking at the future about all the negatives, but actually how do we grow that little seed of hope in individuals and in organisations and in communities. And I'll just leave you with this image, which is an image that came from out of disaster, really. This was a terrible day. This is the Black Saturday fires, which occurred in Victoria, which destroyed 2,500 homes, 175 people died. And in the middle of that, you see this tiny little connection between two organisms that wouldn't normally interact. You don't get very close to koalas. They're not actually very nice, despite what the media might say. And you certainly don't want to shake hands with one because they've got these huge claws, and if you ever have to pick one up, they normally sink them into you. And yet, out of this terrible tragedy, this terrible setting, here's two little beings, two organisms connecting, and what the setting made the impossible possible. And I think that's a really nice way to think about how do we use the setting to make the impossible possible. And I'd like to leave it there. Thanks.
So thank you. I'd now like to introduce Laura Lindenfeld, and she's the director of the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Centre at the University of Maine, and has been doing a lot of work around communication and how we bring groups together and so on. So I'm looking forward to hearing your talk, Laura.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? I've lost my voice, but the amplification certainly helps. First of all, Johan, I want to thank you for having us all here. Thank the University of Dundee and Checker in particular. It's just been an incredibly hospitable and gracious week, so I can't wait to come back to Scotland again someday. It's my first time here. First-time visitor, long-time fan. I live in the wonderful state of Maine, which is in the far northeast of the United States, right up on the Canadian border. I'm curious how many of you may have visited Maine. Anybody here? And did you have the great pleasure of eating lobster when you were in Maine? Good. I'm not going to talk, was it delicious? Yes, some drawn butter. I'm not going to talk about lobster tonight, that's another talk, but I am going to talk about clams, which you may also have eaten while you were there. So you can see from the coastline of Maine that it's a really ragged coast. If you were to stretch it out, it would cover much of the east coast of the United States. You've got northern New England up here in the Gulf of Maine down to Cape Cod, but you stretch that out, it's incredibly long. Lots of islands and little nooks and crannies. And that means that a lot of our livelihood in Maine has been based on the coast and the ocean, food production, and now more and more energy production. So this coast is vulnerable, just like you talked about before, Johan. We have similar vulnerabilities. Ocean acidification, which can affect clams and other species, and flooding, similar kinds of problems you're having here. Truly complex issues that require us to have different kinds of social arrangements than we've had in the past. Just have to take a time out. I'm normally used to walking around, but I have to plant this thing here because I wore a dress, so I can't hook it on my back. I believe that leadership plays a particularly important role in addressing the types of challenges that we face. And what I'd like to talk about is a particular kind of leadership. We need many kinds of leadership, but collaborative leadership is especially important. You see, a bunch of my colleagues and some students standing on a mud flat in Maine. And I'm going to come back and tell you a story about an area called Frenchman Bay. Those of you who were in Maine, did you have the pleasure of visiting Acadia National Park? It's one of the most beautiful areas in the world. Mount Desert Island is what we call it. That's here. And there are people who really work the mud flats there for a living. Collaborative leadership is an arrangement where leaders do not hold power, but rather share it with each other and work together for the good of the community or for the institution. There's a fantastic book by a man named Paul Schmitz called Everyone Leads. I'd encourage you to read it. It goes through different histories of how large social movements really rested on groups of people working together. And we may see the one iconic image of someone like Martin Luther King out in front, but a lot of people behind working together. And I think this is one of the moments of hope and optimism that we need to address problems like climate change. Collaborative leadership is an action anyone can take rather than a position that one person holds. That's really powerful. So what I would argue is that small groups can flex their muscle by taking on tractable problems so that when larger problems emerge, and they will, we have the resilience, the trust, and the social capital to be able to address them. So here's my story. You see to you on the right-hand side of the screen, which is the right side of driving on the road, as far as I'm concerned, a shellfish harvesting area closed. What does this have to do with climate change? What it has to do with climate change is that when we get high precipitation events, lots of rain, and in Maine the rule is 2 inches, they must shut down the flats because sewage overflows into the water. And those clams are no longer edible. Clams, oysters, this is a significant industry in Maine. People's livelihoods depends on this. Clam diggers in particular don't earn a lot of money. So the more days these flats are shut down, the more they lose. The more economic strain on the state, the less tax base. So it becomes one of these really complex, wicked problems. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about collaboration, about collaborative leadership. And you see here on the left, my postdoctoral researcher, Bridie McGreevy, who also took these beautiful pictures, she worked with a group called the Frenchman Bay Partners. And this is a motley crew of people, from conservationists to a university postdoc, to researchers in private labs, to mussel harvesters and clam diggers, work together with the Department of Marine Resources, which is our department in the state of Maine, to come up with an action plan to open up 610 acres that have been provisionally shut, to fix the problem of leakage from those areas so that they could harvest them. There's 2,000 altogether that are permanently shut down. This is 610 they could open. And this collaborative arrangement where they work together, they build trust over time. Shortly, they will be opening 200 acres that have been closed. That may seem really small, but for me, there's a really important lesson. And it has to do with change bearing gifts. Change can be catastrophic. It can be overwhelming. If we can learn to flex our muscles, much like runners who train. Anybody in here run? No? A few? Okay, I've got a few. Exercise? If you just tried to go out and run a marathon today, you would fall over. But if you run a few miles a day and you build your capacity, you can then be more resilient for the greater problems that we face. And I think the small example of these 200 acres, which otherwise would never have been open, is a remarkable opportunity to think about how collaborative leadership could guide us with the challenges we face. Thank you.
Great. Now I'd like to introduce our final speaker, and this is Professor Karen O'Brien, and she's from the University of Oslo, and she's quite well known around the world for she dips in and dips out and throws in these nice gems of insight into often sort of challenging conditions, and has a big influence on how people think about climate change. So I'm going to hand over to Karen. I'm looking forward to your presentation, Karen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here tonight. It's my first time in Scotland, and it's the first time I've been working on climate change since 1988, and this is literally the first time that anyone has come to hear me talk on a Saturday night. So it's very impressive. So I never thought I'd see the day. What I'm going to talk about is adaptation to climate change. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about because it's, as Johan has pointed out, and all the talks have pointed out, changes are underway and we actually have to start to adapt to them. But I'm not interested in the technical aspects of adaptation, how we lift bridges and keep water out or move species and things. I'm interested in adaptation as a social process, as a cultural process, and also as a human process. How do we adapt to changes that we're responsible for? And how do we actually then change the changes that we can do? And I think this builds very well on the 3 talks that you've heard. I'll start with one of the key findings from the IPCC report that came out this year, that human influence on the climate system is clear. This is evident from the increasing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, positive radiative forcing, observed warming, and understanding of the climate system. The last part is really important because a lot of people say, oh, do you believe in climate change or do you not believe in climate change? But it really is based on our understanding of the climate system that we're starting to see these patterns and trends and anomalies. When we look at what the future is, and this is, I pasted in this finding from the synthesis report because I think it's really important. It says, without additional mitigation efforts beyond those in place today, and even with adaptation, warming by the end of the 21st century will lead to high to very high risk of severe, widespread, and irreversible impacts globally, high confidence. And those 3 words, those severe, widespread, and irreversible, you know, we're talking about the future, but we're also talking about today. If you look at these 2 maps, one with substantial mitigation, one without additional mitigation, you see 2 very different worlds emerging. And you'll notice that these are comparisons between 1986 to 2005 and 2081 to 2100. They don't take into account the 0.85 degrees Celsius average warming since 1880. So this is on top of this. And you can see that we're going to have a warmer world. We will need the adaptation. We will need flood defenses, building bridges, moving species, whatever. But we have very, very different types of worlds. How many people here are optimistic, as Paul talked about the future? Seeds of optimism. Okay, I think we find that a lot. And we find that people have this kind of guarded optimism. And what I'm interested in is exactly, you know, how we're seeing this. You notice people are on the edge of their chairs watching, and in many ways we're watching a movie unfold in front of our eyes, and we tend to be, you know, like thinking like, oh, how do we change that movie? And the movie that we're watching tends to be a thriller and a disaster, often like The Day After Tomorrow. Laura has written about this, and she told me about another one called, what was it called? Sharknado or something, with the sharks. And we start to have these ideas that we need to be adapting to this future. Where will you be? What will you do? How will you adapt to a 4-degree world and a 5-degree world, 6-degree world? And that's just by 2100. And the people who are being born today will be alive after that. And what we're starting to see is a normalization and say, oh, we can't actually adapt. You know, we can't get to that 2-degree world. How are we going to adapt to 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees? And that gets me to what are we talking about with adaptation? If we look at the IPCC reports, we say that adaptations are adjustments in natural and human systems in response to actual or expected climate stimuli and their effects which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. And someone said that they're growing wine or grapes for wine here in Scotland, which many people would say, oh, that's a benefit. But when we're looking at it, you know, as a whole, we're looking at adapting to the impacts of climate change. And so we're looking at how do we adapt to that 4-degree world. When I step back and I look at adaptation, I go to the dictionary. And I go to the dictionary and I say adaptation is the process of changing to suit different conditions. And these different conditions are the realization that we are changing the climate system. We are changing the whole ecosystem services. We're changing a system, and that we actually can then do something to change it. So when I look at climate change, I look at it as an adaptive challenge. It's a problem that draws attention to mindsets, including the assumptions and beliefs that underpin individual and shared attitudes and understandings of change itself and our role in change. So an adaptive challenge is adapting here from the inside out. It's not adapting on the screen over there and trying to move things around. And an adaptive challenge, it's personal because it's about what we believe ourselves to be and, you know, what are we capable of. And it's very much in that idea of collaborative power and you know, collaboration, those seeds of hope that Paul talked about. But it's also very political because it's about what we take as given, who we think has power, who decides the future, and whose values count. So when I'm looking at adaptation, I'm looking at it from the personal and the political spirit, and I'm thinking, wow, how do we change that future? So when we have this day after tomorrow, we don't go out there and trying to change everything out there, but we change the script. We change who's writing the script, who is deciding the future. My movie would be called The Decade That Matters. And I think we are in the decade that matters. This is a story of collaboration. It's a love story, not a thriller. And it really would be about people taking that role and playing, you know, doing something about change, working individually, collectively, collaboratively to change that future. And the point that I get the most, the IPCC work depresses me a lot and makes me very sad and things, but what they're saying really is that we have a choice. There are different graphs, there are different maps. So to me, this is the best news about climate change is there is still a curve that is, you know, reasonable below. We still can adapt better to a world where we are working, where it works for more people. So I'm an optimist and yeah. I hope you will be too after the end of the night. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very, very much to all our speakers there. As I say, we've heard about the science internationally, we've heard about the local conditions, we've heard about lessons from Australia, and we've heard about some techniques and some methods by which we might start collaborating to solve the problems. But now it's your chance to ask your questions of the panel. And so can I ask you wait until the microphone comes, and if you just say your name, please, and who's got the first question for the panel? There's a lady down here first.
Thank you. My question is for Margaret. I'm interested in your 200 acres. I'm particularly interested in how, if you have a particular amount of rainfall, which I assume is what you're talking about, and the sewage flows onto the onto the flats, as you call them, how do you then reclaim it? How do you reclaim it? How did you manage the 200 acres?
So what this group did is they actually figured out where the leakages were. That hadn't been addressed. People weren't paying attention because they weren't taking it seriously enough, and the collaborative capacity was not there. That doesn't fix the problem of the 2 inches of rainfall, but it does fix the problem of those areas being temporarily shut down at any given time of year. So there's a more complex story behind this. There are some areas that are going to stay closed, and when there's 2 inches, they all have to shut down. So the more we have these 2-inch rainfalls or more, they have to stay shut. But there are areas that are shut for months of the year just because there was a sewage leakage that wasn't being attended to. So my suggestion is the capacity to address those 200 acres can give us the strength to address other challenges that these coastal areas are facing, and think about other solutions that we haven't explored yet. One of the projects that I'm on, I'm looking at my friend and colleague Glenn Page here, is focused on sustainable ecological aquaculture in Maine and how we can build out that industry, knowing that, you know, there are other threats to clams. I don't want to sound naive. There are green crabs, there's acidification, there's a lot of challenges. We have to think about how to work the oceans differently in ways that are both socially and ecologically and culturally responsive to the particular places. I hope that clarifies the question of the 200 acres.
Yes.
Thanks, Laura. Can I have the next 2 questions? We'll get the microphone to one and we'll have the other in hand to follow on. Where are the next questions? There's one at the back there, the gentleman at the back. And the gentleman there, please. We'll take yours first.
I'm interested in the comments about optimism. I'm conscious of a fight that's going on at the moment between the states bordering the Arctic Circle, with the ice cap melting, that isn't, to my mind, very optimistic, that it's a race for the oil fields under the Antarctic. Do you think that the relationship between what states want and what we might want in terms of climate change are actually compatible?
That's a great question. I live in Norway, which gets a lot of its wealth from oil, and which is, we're seeing a real conflict about that future. I think the Arctic is a hot spot. I think as the Arctic goes, so goes the ocean, so go much of the world. And we're seeing especially generational, people are starting to really challenge. Our government just changed the definition of ice so that we can actually drill for oil in different places. And it got a lot of pushback of, they're using that as an excuse to have access to ice. And it created an uproar, and people are starting to really challenge. And I think many of the oil companies, they do see the writing on the wall about this, but how are we going to manage the oil that is left? Because we do have 4 to 7 times more oil, gas, and coal resources than we can actually use if we want to keep temperatures below 2 degrees. So, and that's why I say that it's political, because it really has to come out at all levels about how do we do that internationally? How do we create these kind of reserves for protecting areas from extraction? And so it's not easy, but we really have to start changing the questions that we're asking and changing the arenas, the institutions. And I think Laura's point about collaboration is you have many different interests, many different ideas. And also, as Paul pointed out, a sense of place. It's the little things that matter to people and not the big things. And people want an ecological legacy, not an economic legacy, because the economic legacy is in the ecology. So you're absolutely right that that's a big issue. And the Greenland ice sheet, the minerals that are under it, all of those things should be at the top of our agendas politically and socially. So.
Paul, can I ask you, have you anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt there's huge issues. We all know the challenges, and we all know the role of multinationals and states in the politics that needs to play out to solve some of these problems. But who are states? They're us. So, how does this happen? How does this disconnect happen? States and multinationals are us. We own them. We made them. They're made of people. They're made of values. And so I think the whole divestment movement, the role of social media, the role of people walking away from big multinationals, we've had a whole lot of campaigns in Australia to just say, if you don't behave properly, we will not buy your things. And they matter. Those things are changing. Companies are responding very quickly. And I always love that book, Fast Food Nation, and it's a great story. If you haven't read it, it's a great story. It goes through the history of fast food, but the thing it says at the end, what can you do about all this? Don't walk in the door. That's how you change it. And I think it's the same. I mean, these organisations are us. And so we need to get them to respond to us. And we're actually quite powerful. And we've seen, certainly in Australia, we've seen a number of campaigns against companies, and they change just like that, much faster than if you tried to change through regulation or if you tried to, go through any other pathway. We know we can hit them where it hurts in terms of the profit side of it. And as soon as that starts to happen, things change very quickly. So I see a sort of almost a tipping point approaching around corporate responsibility that is going to be very difficult for companies to avoid, because the way the community is now connected, the way choices are being made by communities through social media, I think is a totally new dynamic on the globe. We haven't seen this, before. We were just looking the other day. There's something like 19 billion emails sent every day around the globe. So, the connection on the planet, we now have a connection between human beings that we've never had in our past. That just brings this awesome potential power of connection that we've never had. So I'm actually quite optimistic about, there's a hell of a lot of problems, and I'm an ecologist by training, and I look at what's happening in our country to the ecology, and it's very depressing. But I'm quite optimistic about our ability to change the dynamics of some of these global political and geopolitical issues just simply through people and people changing the way they behave. So.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, next question.
Thank you very much. My question has to do with Yeah, climate change now, obviously, is a belief. It's more than just a belief, but it's a reality. Which, of course, demands a global challenge, a global approach to resolve it. However, seated within the climate change debate itself is economic and how we're using fossil fuel to make economic production. So just after the last ended Lima conference, I was given momentum that coming Paris 2015, there's a possibility of reaching a climate agreement to tackle climate change once and for all. Then just the beginning of this year, or later last year and the beginning of this year, oil prices begin to go down for the record timing. And the Financial Times reported last 2 weeks that China made their record oil import. So my question then goes with, oil now is far cheaper than renewables, which of course give a better chance for us to sustain our climate. My question is there a possibility of having global leaders reaching a climate agreement in Paris, given that oil prices continue to go down? Thank you very much.
Good question.
Well, that's a very wide-ranging question. Who'd like to have a go at that first?
Looking at you.
Anybody?
Yeah, again, there are several questions in there, several really good points about that. You know, one thing is about Paris, what type of agreements, and people are really pointing more towards voluntary and every state doing their best and putting up their, what they can achieve. But underlying that, what you were talking about is the relationship that climate change isn't just an environmental issue.
Right.
It's linked very much to our economic system, to our financial system, to the way we've organized society. And when you have like the financial system where interest rates are linked to the price of oil, and you're getting all sorts of different feedbacks. So how can you then reduce greenhouse gas emissions when it automatically kicks in a feedback to lower oil prices or things? I mean, it's much more complex. So we have to actually look at the problem much wider and much more systemically if we're going to address it. And that means really addressing the economics of it and going beyond business as usual, going on beyond development as usual, and challenging that. And we see that there are alternatives coming up. There's collaborative economies, there's sharing economies, there are people who are challenging that very system. And just because oil is cheap, if you have an alternative, we can actually, it might be that one day, and I think it will be very soon, we will just say, oh, we burned the stuff, because oil is a valuable resource, and it's something that we use for so many things in this room are based on oil, and we can certainly use it over the next thousands of years rather than decades. So,
Laura, have you any thoughts on that?
This is such a complex issue. I want to come back to the optimism piece, because it would be very easy to look at this and think there's these powers that are so high up over which I personally don't have influence. What I would say is, when you look at the research on what kind of messages to send to people under what conditions, bear with me for a minute. If someone is in a depressed state, it's more effective to tell them what not to do, right? So in health, don't do this, don't do that. If someone is in an energized state, which is either angry or happy or excited, it's more effective to tell them what to do. So I don't know that I personally can have a direct influence on this or even answer your question, because it's such a big one. But I know that embracing optimism as a strategy, and that is that choice, that's that choice in the road that we can all make. It's going to make us more open to being able to engage. All of us together can make a tremendous difference, and I don't want us to forget that. It's so easy to become despaired when you see what's happening. So I'm circumventing your question a bit, because I'm really not the expert to answer it. But at a different level, really the choice rests with us to think about the kind of future that we want to shape together.
Do you want to?
Yeah, in a similar way, I'm not an expert in economic systems, but I think there's a link in here with issues of fairness, and I brought up this issue of moral issue, and I think that's really, really critical. Some recent research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation looked at who are the greatest emitters in the UK and who are the least emitters. Not surprisingly, those with greater financial resources tend to emit a lot more emissions than those who don't, so they travel more and so on. But they're also the ones that are gaining most from the policies that are aimed at reducing emissions. So the wealthy in our society are the ones that can afford to put on their solar panels on their roofs, and the least wealthy are not, for example. So all the policies that are subsidising these solar panels mean that those who are emitting the most are actually gaining the most from their energy reductions from doing that. So there's a whole kind of set of fairness in this whole economic issue. And once that's brought into the equation, into the question, then that actually gives a space for completely reframing the whole point of what we're doing. And a lot of the things that we talk about, well, we need oil for jobs, we need oil for all that sort of thing. A lot of it's held in large companies, or it's held in affluent sort of circumstances. And often these are then the situations that are driving the sort of policies that we're looking at. So there's a kind of issue of fairness in all this. I know it's not answered your question directly, but I think once we start reframing about what is fair, who is producing what, and who is affecting who, then you start getting into the real question about the issues that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ian. Can I have the next two questions, please? Right, gentleman there, and the second one. Ah, yes, please. Ah, yes, this lady here. So
once our chairman has finished picking out who's going to ask the next question, can I ask this coming one? This is particularly aimed at Paul Ryan, but maybe the others as well. We've heard already the mention about collective leadership, but also really in a way political leadership is just so important. And in Australia, and I'm not really quite sure of the situation now, but until fairly recently, the powers that be there were, so far as I understand, very much against the idea about climate being so important, and they had other things to worry about. So is it changing in Australia? What can be done in Australia? And also, of course, the same applies to the States and to Europe. Yeah. So could I ask you the question first? What's happening in Australia about leadership on climate change?
Well, thanks for that. I was actually enjoying myself up until that point.
I'm glad you asked him.
Look, the politics around climate change in Australia have been toxic. We're the largest emitters per capita in the world, and we have got a moral responsibility. I believe we have a moral responsibility to act on climate change and to lead. Now, our total emissions are tiny. So overall, the total emissions are tiny, but per capita, we're the largest emitters in the world. And there's good reasons for that because of our economy and the structure of our social systems, etc., and we drive a lot, all that sort of stuff. But the politics around it have been really interesting because it was the conservative side of politics that suggested a trading scheme, an emissions trading scheme. So they were the first ones to suggest we should put a price on carbon. They took it to an election and with the proposal to bring in a trading scheme down the track, and they got into power and they started working towards that. Then the politics globally around climate change started to change, and the politics in Australia started to change. The issue you're talking about, the particular issue was where we did actually have a trading scheme brought in under the Labor government. They went to an election proposing that they wouldn't have a trading scheme for a start, then at the last minute changed and said, now we will have one. Now what happened was once they got into power, they introduced an emissions trading scheme, a price on carbon. The opposition, the then opposition who'd previously proposed it initially, said that that this was a tax, and they just did one of those incredibly smart reframings that we talk about. They just reframed it. So instead of it being a price on carbon, it became a tax, and they called it the carbon tax, and everyone now calls it the carbon tax. what we saw around that then was a whole process of destabilising the science around carbon and around climate change, around demonising certain parts of the community who support climate change and those who don't, and all that sort of stuff. It's become incredibly complex and hostile, and the support for action on climate change plummeted. So it went from something like 80% bipartisan support down to 30%. What we saw then was, though, the now government who's back in, who were the guys who originally proposed it, the conservative side of politics, came in, scrapped the carbon tax, and are now saying there will never be another carbon tax introduced into Australia. The opposition are now saying we'll reintroduce it. So we've literally had a flipping backwards and forwards, and it's just simply around polling. It is around popularity. Everyone knows we need a price on carbon. When it was in for a very short period of time, it was working. It worked instantly. It was introduced. It started to have a fairly significant impact on our emissions, more so than a range of other things, although our emissions have been going down for a range of reasons. So what we've done is wasted about a decade and a half. We've disenfranchised a whole lot of people from the political process. We've stripped out our scientific capacity, or a lot of it, around climate change. One of the things this current government did when they came to power was to deliberately reach into CSIRO, our very large national science organisation, and deliberately target people working on climate change for redundancies and things like that. So we've seen a whole lot of damage to the system. We've seen a whole lot of inaction. And in the meantime, we saw the effects of the sort of stuff that I'm talking about. And we are no further ahead, and there's no winners. And we're going to end up with a carbon price. Ultimately, it's whether it's this year, next year, or in 5 years' time. So we've had this flipping backwards and forwards. We've had people changing sides in the argument, even though they might be on one side of politics. They're saying, you know, one election we won't have it, and the next election we will have it, all that sort of stuff. All we've done is wasted time. So my belief, there's quite a lot of support building again now for climate, for some kind of price on carbon. The effects of climate change are very clear, and lots of people are being impacted. I didn't mention we've had massive flooding in Australia in 2011 and 12. An area of the size of Western Europe was flooded in Australia. So, you know, we've had massive impacts. The costs are mounting, and lots of people are feeling the costs. And so there is actually now a lot more support, but we haven't got the political leadership to actually stand up and take us in a positive direction. We're being poll-driven, like everywhere. I know you guys all have the same issues. But so to me, it's been a great frustration of just this flipping backwards and forwards, because if we actually all lined up and we disagreed, okay, eventually we might get somewhere. But people have been, you know, political parties swapping sides around this for a long period of time.
Can I, on this one, Paul, could I just ask, it seems a very interesting question, because I start looking from what you've been saying about what the international dimensions of that are. And if you look at what's happened to us in the UK recently, you know, we've seen the impacts of gas, shale gas in America, which has displaced their coal, and that coal now is with us, displacing our gas. So we're finding that our emissions strategies are being impacted quite substantially. And, you know, the last 2 years, Scotland's very particularly upbeat pressure to reduce its climate change effects have been penetrated by greater carbon emissions from electricity generation, despite the fact that we're driving a very renewables strategy. But, I mean, do any of the other panel want to just talk about that in any way, the international impacts of what we're all doing in our countries, but what global effect it's having?
I guess that's why, why people run global models, and why we need to deal with it as a collective problem, a commons problem, something that where the left hand and the right hand have to actually be doing the same thing and orchestrating it. And that's, as we talked about, that's complex. And I think it's really, we have people operating in different systems. I'm looking at the gas system, I'm looking at the oil, but we're trying to see that they are all connected. And that is the challenge. But there are also these, what we're looking for is the leverage points for change. And often, to change a system, when you look at the leverage points, one of the highest leverage points is changing the goal of the system. And when we start to change the goal towards the Sustainable Development Goals, or changing the goal away from GDP and productivity towards something else, a sustainable or something, we will change everything. But right now, our goal still is higher growth and GDP and things. So the highest leverage point is a paradigm shift, though, and that's what I think we also have to work on through education, and we see it coming through youth. I have a project on Voices of the Future, on the visions and values of Norwegian youth, and you start to see that they are changing. They are actually connecting the dots in a different way and challenging things, and working internationally with youth in Australia, with youth in Kenya, with youth all over, and that's where, to look where the energy is, the other type of energy is the...
I think that's a question we could talk about a great deal more, but we need to move on. Next question, please.
I'm afraid I'm a pessimist. Having listened to our 4 speakers tonight, I'm even more pessimistic. My speakers, who I think should be here tonight, are by the name of Lovelock and Emmett. 2 gentlemen who have studied this situation, particularly from the point of view of the human numbers who are going to suffer in this century, in the lifetimes of the younger people who are still here. Not my lifetime. I've only got another 10 years to do, so I'm all right. But for their sakes, I think these people tonight will be seen in the future as being very irresponsible. There is no reason for optimism in our present situation. Our numbers are increasing, they're forecast to increase, and the ability of the globe to support these people is diminishing as we speak. So I'm afraid you really need to get to the core of the situation, namely that the prospects for humanity are not very bright. Not very bright at all. Particularly in the view of the views that are being expressed here tonight, full of optimism. There is no cause for optimism.
Well,
I speak as a gentleman who was trained as a geographer in my youth, and I've kept up to date. But one of the critical events of my life was when I visited a village high up in the Himalayas. My job was to go around villages and test the pupils for admission to a very advanced school which we had built in Kathmandu, or just on the outskirts of Kathmandu. It was a rather bizarre situation because my Nepali was virtually non-existent, so I was presenting them with an objective test and marking it on the basis of how far the kids' replies correlated with the marks on the piece of paper which I took around with, which had the correct answers. I couldn't read either. But nevertheless, that was a bizarre situation. But as we approached this particular village, we heard a woman screaming. And my wife, who was with me, who was a trained midwife, said, "That woman's in childbirth." I said, "Well, can you do anything?" So I disappeared because the screaming was horrendous. I'd never heard a woman scream in childbirth. One doesn't hear it these days. They're taken off to things called maternity hospitals. They don't have them at home any longer.
And I'm sorry, could we get to the point?
Oh, yeah, I'm getting to a very important point, sir. I realize you don't realize it's an important point. But I'll cut to what happened. The next morning, when we were leaving this village, we were told we couldn't go back the way we'd come, which was the easy way out because it was all downhill. We had to go round, skirt around, and do some more climbing. And I climbed enough. And when I remonstrated with my Nepali colleague, he said, "Oh, but see, they put the kid up on the hillside the way we were due to leave, and it would probably disturb you." I said, "Yes, it certainly would." "Well, they put the kid up there." Well, the village knew that they couldn't support that child. And so I turned and said, "Do you mean to say that woman went through all that pain and distress and then the child's just put up on the hillside to die. Yes, they said. But then came the critical remark, which has ridden me ever since. But she knew. I said, she knew? Yes. As soon as she became conceived, became pregnant, the village knew that that child would be put up on the hillside. There was no grounds for, no means of aborting the child. The woman had to go through 9 months of pregnancy and give birth under distressing circumstances, knowing that the child was going to be put up on the hillside. That is how real people live, not in our highly technical world which removes you from reality. They have lived that way for years. And that is the kind of life that's going to return to us if we don't face up to the consequences of our increasing numbers and our diminishing ability of the globe to support us. I hope I've made my point.
Thank you. I'm going to ask our panel now, and I'm going to go to Ian first. And I think the issue that we're addressing is the one that there is no grounds for optimism in this.
Well, I think you've actually just answered your question, because you've pointed out that we have to make these choices. We have to make these choices, and we have to come to the reality of what's happening, which I completely and utterly agree with you. The reality is that things are coming, and they're very, very difficult to deal with. But we actually have a choice, and I think Karen was pointing that out in her talk. The potential that we have in this room at this moment for making a change, if we all went out and wrote to our MPs, that might make a difference. If we put all our resources together in this room, we could make quite a significant difference. So if we take all the potential aspects of what might be in this room at this moment, we could actually start making a difference. And so really it comes down to what we want to do. And it's like a half glass empty or a half glass full. The glass is still got the same amount of water in. We are coming to a tipping point where there's an increasing interest. Increasingly people are experiencing the effects of climate change. The opinions are changing about climate change. The realizations are changing about climate change. We can make that tipping point. We can take it either into a half glass full or a half glass empty. Personally, I know which way I would like to go. Thank you.
Well, have you any thoughts on this one?
Optimism doesn't mean you're naive. Optimism means that you choose to find a pathway that can empower you to make a difference. That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah, I don't think there's anybody I know working on climate change who doesn't really feel it, who actually, I mean, there's been times when I've been working on an IPCC report and just burst into tears when I get to the sea level rise section. And it just, and I'm meeting with my students this week too. How does it affect students emotionally? And it is very hard, but when, as a human geographer, we look at vulnerability, and it's not just vulnerability to the hazard and events, but it's socially created. It's about why we have people on hillsides, why we have people, why we don't have enough resources to actually, or access to resources, access to water, access to food, how it's distributed. Going back to what Johan said, it is an equity issue. It's about justice. So a lot of the things that are creating the vulnerability can be addressed through politics, through planning, through civil society and social movements, and that's where the optimism actually is. And sure, the ocean is acidifying and that, you know, the Arctic is melting. We are going to be dealing with very negative and hard things, but you know, we actually can do much better than we're doing now. That's the optimism.
Paul, you actually said we had to be optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I still believe it. I think the humanity's faced lots of crises in the past, and we make decisions about how to act. So in the lead up to wars and the, you know, the sorts of challenges all groups of humans have faced in the past at different times. At that time was the most significant challenge for that group of people. So this is our one now, and we will make choices, and we do have choices, and we can act, and we have a lot of resources, and we have a lot of capacity to make a choice to do something different. It's just that we haven't, I don't think we've quite reached the crisis point where people see the need to act rapidly. You know, I'm not very optimistic about what will happen in Paris. I don't think we'll get an agreement, an international agreement that drives much change right now, but it's another step closer, and the next one will get another step closer, etc. And I think once we actually get close to the tipping point, we'll see a lot of action quickly. The trouble is there'll be a lot of legacy. We will have a whole lot of issues that we're going to have to deal with. As Karen just mentioned, we're not going to get out of this by sort of going at some point, oh, we made a mistake, I want to go back. We have, you know, complex systems only go forward. We're not going back. We're not going back to some other, period in the past. We only go forward, and it will be the direction that we choose to take and make certain decisions about that determines what that forward pathway looks like. I think we need optimism, or otherwise, what do we tell people? What do we tell people about how we should act? Should we say, don't act?
Well, I can give you an answer.
I don't think we've got time, but it's actually, these guys teach every day with students, and I do work with students too. What do you tell people?
Well, could I respond to that? Because I did mention when I opened that the Al Gore discussion. Yeah. Now, the thing about that, it's a relatively short video on YouTube, but he, as I say, talks about all the downsides, but I think the opportunities to actually change things he deals with very simply, illustrates it very well, and I think any of you who are searching for that optimism should at least hear him out. So it's maybe something you do after this evening. We've probably time, there's a question in the lady in the middle there. And we may maybe just have time for one more then after that.
There are charities which are trying to help with population concern. It started as Population Concern and then became Interact and then became Plan. And they work in countries, particularly, for instance, India, where they are allowed to have birth control and contraception, but the country doesn't do it. And they are trying very hard to teach the women and the men family planning plus contraception.
Any response or thought? No?
We must always think about the role of culture. It's not just about economics, it's about how people make meaning and what's important. And it's about affect, it's about how you feel. That's what mobilizes people to change, not necessarily more knowledge. The knowledge is really important, don't get me wrong. It's about what you feel that enables you to mobilize that knowledge to make the difference we need to see. And I would argue together.
I mean, one of the issues there is the extent to which communities actually feel able to be empowered and take control of their own situations and help deliver their own solutions. And interestingly, again in Scotland, we've got the Community Empowerment Bill that's going through our Parliament at the moment, which is supposed to do just that. But it's a big transition, and actually putting these sort of decisions back into communities' hands and giving them the tools to help deliver something for themselves, to me, must be good, but a difficult route to start out on. One last question then before we close. I've got lots of hands now.
3 more.
I'm going to take the question from over here because I don't think we've had any from this side. I'm sorry about this.
It's for Mr. Ryan. I know you're on about the acidification and the greenhouse gases, but Professor Ian Stewart, who's a geographer who's actually spoken here, he mentioned that Australia is actually moving towards Asia. So no matter what you do about the gases going into the atmosphere, the fact that Australia is actually drifting north towards Asia is going to change your climate anyway.
It's pretty slow. It's moving pretty slow.
It's going to happen.
I mean, the rate of change of the global system is far greater than our progress north. Yeah, but it's about 2 centimetres a year or something we're moving. So.
Well, that was a pretty short answer. So the lady at the back there.
It's clear that optimism is key in the whole thing, but I was wondering how we can build that momentum for positive action on more of a community level when maybe your neighbours don't necessarily care that much or know very much about climate change.
Ian, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, I can start with that. That's a really, really good question, and it's not an easy one to deliver. But I've worked both in the South Pacific with rural communities there, and increasingly working with some of the communities in Scotland. In all of these communities are facing change, lots of different kinds of change. And what we find is that it's often not climate change that you start talking to people about. You start talking about, as you've already highlighted, that it's the things that matter to them that then you can start building a conversation around. And it's difficult, it's not easy. It's about how you build capacity for dealing with that, particularly difficult given that local authorities now have much less resources to deliver things. But in an ironic kind of way, that also creates opportunities because it actually allows a degree of ownership and responsibility that can emerge from the communities themselves. In the case of the work in the South Pacific, we really just built up conversations, and we capitalised there. They had much stronger social kind of capital, social connection and social cohesion. And we drew on the resources that they already had and were able to deliver themselves. And that was really, really important. We're just starting the work in the Scottish borders, and that's really at the beginning, so we're waiting to see how that emerges. But some of the local authorities in Scotland, there's 3 in particular, that have been working very much to, they've started from an emergency management kind of perspective. So they've been looking at how they can build resilience in communities in relation to flooding. Now the traditional response is all the emergency services come in and help communities to do that. That still happens. But they're starting to realise that you can dramatically increase the way in which communities can deal with that by helping them work together in very, very simple and basic ways. Increasing communication, knowing where the gritter plans are so that you know when the snow comes, they know where to focus their work. Knowing the communication between, knowing who is perhaps not on a National Health Service risk register because they're particularly ill, but where the elderly might be, who might not be on that kind of register, but after 2 or 3 days of no electricity are going to be very vulnerable. So there are lots of ways of doing that. And some of the experience in the Scottish borders, for example, they're finding that some of the community groups have got together and they've mobilised because they can focus around these particular issues like flooding. But actually what's starting is these different community groups are saying, well, there's no floods at the moment, so what else can we do? So actually what they're actually doing is they're starting to hand out things like streamers so they can go and clear the paths. And I was talking to an individual not that long ago and I was saying, well, what's going to happen in 10, 15, 20 years? He said, well, they're going to be driving all the tractors for us and all that kind of stuff. So it's actually about rebuilding social capital that then creates that space for all sorts of changes to happen. And it's about reclaiming that relationship and that space and the trust and the collaborations that the others have been talking about.
Thanks for that. And can I say thank you to you all for your questions this evening. And to close, I'm just going to ask Ian Fahey to give a vote of thanks.
Yes, well, I'm going to keep it very brief and short, but I've certainly enjoyed this evening and the questions and listening to our speakers. We've been very, very lucky to have these international speakers with us and the others that are visiting at this sort of stage. So before I give the sort of vote of thanks, the final thanks, I'd just like to invite you all. We now have a drink session downstairs. It's open to everybody. You can come down, and if you have other questions and you haven't been able to ask them, you can come and ask them to us down there as well. And we'll be happy to answer those after this event. So please come down and have a drink and share with us our optimism, if you like, for what might happen in the future. So just like to thank our chair and our 3 distinguished speakers that have been here tonight. Thank you.